Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're now live on Facebook. We'd just like to start off by saying, giving salams to everyone and a warm welcome.
Okay.
Salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala
Assalamu
alihi wa
alaikum wa
sahbihi
rahmatullah,
ajma'in.
everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're now live on Facebook.
Are you guys hearing an echo?
We'd just like to start off by saying, giving salams to everyone and a warm welcome. Okay. Salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad.
Okay. First, I would like to introduce our young student, Mujahid. He is going to read the land acknowledgement for us, inshallah. Go ahead, Mujahid.
Okay. I wish to begin this event by first acknowledging the land on which most of us are now living. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. May Allah bless, protect, and ratify them. Ameen.
Ameen. Thank you very much, Mujahid.
No
I always
problem.
like to have our young people come in and join us when we can get them to come in and join our lives. Okay, alhamdulillah. So now we have, just get right into it. We're going to have a small talk by Dr. Afua Cooper, and then we're going to open the floor to discussions and questions. And I'll be assisted by some other members of BCM's admin as well. But just to introduce Dr. Afua Cooper, for those who don't know her, which is probably not very many people, mashallah. Dr. Afua is an award-winning scholar, artist, activist whose research on slavery, abolition, freedom, Black education, and women's studies across Canada has made her a leading figure in African Canadian studies. Her book, The Hanging of Angelique, The Untold Story of Slavery in Canada and the Burning of Old Montreal, broke new grounds in the study of Canadian Atlantic slavery. Angelique was nominated for a Governor General Award and named by BBC as one of the best books published in Canada. A recognized poet, spoken word artist, and word master, Dr. Afua has published 6 books of poetry and serves as Halifax 7th Poet Laureate. Winner of the Portia White Prize for her contribution to the cultural arts in Nova Scotia, Dr. Afua currently teaches history in the Department of Dalhousie University with a cross appointment in sociology and social anthropology, gender and women's studies. MashaAllah. Go ahead, Dr. Afua, please.
Thank you, Bilkis. I was just waiting on the host to unmute me. Assalamu alaikum to everyone who is on the call. And thanks to Bilkis for inviting me this evening on behalf of the organization to give this talk on some of the links between Black people on this continent and indigenous people on the continent of North America. I also would like to give the African ancestors acknowledgement because we don't acknowledge, we often do not acknowledge the African ancestors. So I do that. And so I said, I honor our ancestors from Africa who came across the Atlantic on the Middle Passage in the bottom of slave ships and worked for 400 years as enslaved people. Because of them, we are here. They built new societies. They taught us resilience and survival, and we thank them. So I'm gonna jump right into it. The command I was given sort of was to look at several rubrics: cultural erasure, forced assimilation, marginalization, and institutionalized racism. So all of those four components or categories, Black people and Indigenous people on this continent were victims of. The whole issue of cultural erasure, we're still dealing with that now in Canada, in North America, all across the world with Indigenous communities, in Australia. Forced assimilation, my last name is Cooper, that's part of the forced assimilation. When I was watching the Olympics, it became so very evident, this history of colonialism and forced assimilation and natal alienation was so evident during the Olympics. When you look at the names of the athletes from the African diaspora, so from places like the Caribbean, Britain, United States, they all had, these names: Allison, Felix, Andre de Grasse, Elaine Thompson. And when you look at them, they look like they're from Africa. They are from Africa. And one question I ask myself is, what if they were running for Africa? What if we didn't have the slave trade and, this great tragedy that befell Black people? And, Simone Biles, who is the greatest of all times gymnast, what if she was doing her gymnastic routines for Senegal or Tanzania, or South Africa, and not the United States? What if Elaine Thompson, Sherika Jackson were running for Ghana and not Jamaica? What if this whole construct called Jamaica or Canada did not exist? But they came about, this construct, because of conquest and colonization and slavery. And so part of the forced assimilation was the renaming of these people, which befell both groups, is forced assimilation. The scholar of slavery, Orlando Patterson, he has a name for it. He calls it social death, that enslaved people experience social death because they lost their names, they lost memory of their lineage, they were powerless in the face of the power of the slave owners, the white people. The whole issue of marginalization, very, very true today in North America. Black people are among, and South America and the Caribbean, are among the most marginalized people. And we talk about institutional racism as pervading every aspect of society. So we can start thinking about this phrase, you've heard it before: stolen people, African people stolen from Africa on stolen land. Stolen people on stolen land, land stolen from the indigenous people by the European colonizers and slaveholders. A main difference between, indigenous people and African people in these continents is that indigenous people are the original owners of the land. They have a kind of a blood claim to this land in a way that some African groups do not have, even though some people would debate me on that. Because African peoples, in terms of enslavement, and I'm not going to talk about the migration of African peoples to the Americas before enslavement. We know evidence exists to that, and we may be able to talk about it, that aspect, in the Q&A. But after 400 or 500 years of slavery and colonization in these Americas, some would argue that Black people do have a right to these lands, do have claims to these lands, because in terms of the European, quote unquote, development of these societies, that was premised on the backs of African people, not just the backs, but the brains, because it was the brains of enslaved people, the intellectual capital, our bodies as financial capital that built the Americas. And was a foundation of the capitalist system, and also assisted in the evolution of the capitalist system in the Americas and across the world. So, until European nations and European nations, also Canada and the United States, are willing to pay reparations in whatever way you want to define that, and say, all you people who are here, all you millions of people, 100, maybe you need to go back to Africa, because that has not been dealt with. That legacy of slavery, our dispossession and our alienation has not been dealt with. We see that happening for Indigenous people right now. The most recent example would be the Truth and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission happening in Canada. So the colonization, the dispossession happened to both groups. And it is at this point of colonization and dispossession, at this node, this nexus, that both groups met within the Americas. So if we think of a place and a site on which both groups met within the Americas, so I'm going to introduce the whole concept of resistance here, and a site on which both groups met would be in Maroon communities, in Palenques, in Quilombos within the Americas. So the first Maroon communities, when the first Africans ran away from slavery in Spanish colonies, because the Spaniards were the first, and then the Portuguese, when they escaped from the sites of bondage into the swamps, into the mountains, into wherever, away from the white power structure, away from plantations, sometimes they ran with Indigenous people. We know that's a fact. We don't have to argue about that. Because when certain Maroon communities were excavated, they found Indigenous artifacts and so on, along with African artifacts. So the Palenques are the names of Maroon settlements in Spanish America, and the Quilombos are the names of Maroon settlements in Portuguese America, that is Brazil. So you find collaboration between both groups in these places, right? But it was not always collaboration, and we'll get to that. Another area or another geographic site where you found this resistance happening was in the United States. And I'm just gonna briefly talk about the Seminole Wars. The Seminoles were and are a group of indigenous people, mainly from what is now Florida, parts of southern Georgia and Alabama, but mainly Florida. And the Seminoles engaged in a series of war with the United States government from about 1816 to 1858. There were like 3 Seminole Wars, right? They were also involved with the British government during the War of 1812. Some Seminoles sided with the British against the Americans. But after that war ended and the United States empire started to expand, Florida was a Spanish colony. And the Seminoles felt safer under Spain than under the United States. But eventually, through American aggression, Florida was acquired by the United States. And the Seminoles fought 3 wars with the United States government for their sovereignty, for their independence, and for their autonomy. The Second Seminole War was more or less what historians call a Negro War, because runaway slaves from the Carolinas, from Georgia, would escape to slavery in Florida, which was a Spanish colony. And the Spanish government would give them refuge. Hundreds of them settled among the Seminoles. There were free Blacks living among the Seminoles. The Seminoles also had slaves. They also had Black slaves. So there were 3 communities of Blacks among the Seminoles. You had free Blacks, you had runaway slaves, fugitives, and you have enslaved people who were owned by the Seminoles. During the Second War, the United States government wanted to capture all Blacks from the Seminole tribe and return them to slavery or enslave them. And so the Second War broke out. Eventually, the United States as I said, from 1816 to about 1858, this war in 3 phases lasted. The United States government was able to defeat the Seminoles and basically took Florida. Like it was not pretty. United States government killed thousands and thousands of Seminoles. The Blacks among them put up a fierce resistance. Some of the Black people, there's a fort called Fort Negro. At one point it was called Fort Moise. It was defended by Black people, men, women, and children. The United States Army blew it up and just killed a lot of people. But there was such fierce resistance from the indigenous people and also from the Black people who became part of the tribe. There's a book called Florida's Negro War, Black Seminoles and the Second Seminole War by a scholar by the name of Anthony Dixon that talks in great detail about this war. And so this is a great example of the two groups collaborating, of the two groups facing alienation, facing dispossession, facing institutionalized racism, and facing cultural erasure. Now, one of the ways that the United States government defeated or marginalized the Seminoles was to move them from the eastern part of the United States, Florida, the eastern seaboard, to west of the Mississippi, in what I'm sure some of you know, this phenomenon, this event really called the Trail of Tears, where they moved members, thousands of people from the so-called 5 civilized tribes, and we can talk about that later, move them to west of the Mississippi into what's called Indian Territory, which became later on Oklahoma and other states. So the United States government stole their land and then moved them away from the land. You've heard of the Trail of Tears. But it wasn't only indigenous people who were on the Trail of Tears. There were thousands of enslaved Blacks who walked the Trail of Tears with indigenous people. And these were enslaved people, Black people who were owned by these 5 civilized tribes, as they were called. And they also walked the Trail of Tears. That part of history is usually not remembered, that there were Black people who were on the Trail of Tears too. So that's a situation where you had collaboration and a resistance to this outside power, this power, the United States government in this case, that was bent on just supreme hegemony of the land, of this particular landscape. And of course, you know, the man, he became president. He was a big military commander in the United States military, Andrew Jackson. You've heard the name. He was a slaveholder himself. He owned over 100 enslaved Africans. Andrew Jackson was also known as an Indian killer because he was one of the main people that defeated the Seminoles through brutal methods in Florida and elsewhere. And for the Americans, Andrew Jackson was a hero of the War of 1812. Now, if let's just come up to Canada, there's a professor at Detroit Mercy by the name of Roy Finkenbein, who will shortly be publishing a book called The Indigenous Underground Railroad, and in which the book is really about his research, showcasing his research on the phenomenon, the history of the Underground Railroad, by looking at how indigenous communities within the states in which the Underground Railroad routes ran helped enslaved Africans or runaway slaves as they fled from both the lower South and the upper South to northern states. And as we know, thousands of them eventually came further north to Canada. Many of runaway slaves were aided by indigenous communities along the way. And these indigenous communities still had sovereignty, it's important to know that for the longest while, indigenous communities still had sovereignty before, the shock of the so-called Indian wars that really rolled across the continent from east to west and decimated communities and took away the sovereignty from many of these communities. So indigenous communities, people aided and lent support and rescued and hid Black people who ran away from slavery. He notes that geneticists have found among the northern Ojibwe people, that's kind of like northern Michigan crossing over Lake Huron into the middle and the top part of Ontario, among the Ojibwe people, a haplogroup, it's, genes really, from sub-Saharan Africa. And they were really surprised when they did their genetic research on the northern Ojibwe to find that a dominant haplogroup among them belonged to people from sub-Saharan Africa. And he said, well, it makes sense because so many Black people lived as they fled from South, coming north and coming into Canada, lived among indigenous communities. Well, Black people among the tribes were used for many purposes. If you say, well, sure, many of them gained refuge by living in these communities, but it was a reciprocal relationship because Black people were used for translation purposes. Still, 1850s, 1800s, mid-17th century, many of the tribes did not speak English very well. The Black people, talking about being forced assimilation, cultural erasure, coming from plantations, coming from American cities, were by then fluent in the English language. So oftentimes when indigenous communities wanted to send embassies and diplomats to engage in discussions with the white people, these could be government people or business people or whatever, they would, among these embassies, you would see Black people. You'd see Black people. And they themselves, many of them became chiefs and diplomats, but also translators, because they would have known the indigenous language and they were also fluent in English. So they were used for translation purposes. They practiced specific Western cultural practices. And these skills, were needed by the tribe, right? If you think about it. The Canadian government, or what became the Canadian government, what became the United States government, for the longest while, before the conquest, certainly before so many of the wars, would, even if they were not serious, even if it was a mockery, would treat indigenous people as sovereign nations. And, I pause at that because there was a time when the settlers really, really needed indigenous people, because without the skills, what indigenous people brought to the table, without certain items of trade, the relationship wouldn't happen. Black people were very much steeped in these Western cultural practices. And if they were adopted by the tribes, let's say the Northern Ojibwe people, then in many instances, as I've said before, they would be part of the parties, the diplomatic parties that went to have discussions with these various settler governments. Roy Finkenbein, the professor whose name I just mentioned, who's researching the Indigenous Underground Railroad, he said there was sometimes a very intentional, sometimes the tribes had, a specific intention of diversifying their gene pool, especially as many of the nations lost people during the wars. You know, from about 1763 onward, and some people argue before 1763, on the continents, there's a series of what's called Indian wars that decimated indigenous communities, right? And many of these communities needed people. And so in rescuing and supporting runaway slaves on the Underground Railroad, for them, it was an advantage because they could beef up their human resources and diversify the gene pool. And we know the gene pool did become diversified with the genetic research that has been conducted on some of these nations. Now, I talked about it was not always the situation that was brought about sometimes by collaboration, but it wasn't a relationship that rested all the time on collaboration, and both oppressed groups are, you know, supporting each other and fighting for each other and putting up resistance together. No, there was also tension. And you must remember that all of this is happening within the context of a growing white supremacist settler state. And if we talk about forced assimilation, cultural erasure, then what happens is that many people, including Black people, as we know, but in more specifically here, indigenous people are going to adopt some of the white supremacist ways of the oppressor, are going to adopt some of the ideologies concerning Black people, ideologies that you know, talk about Black inferiority, for example. So earlier on, I mentioned the 5 civilized tribes, and they're called civilized because they took on, in many instances, a European way of life. Many of them settled down and became farmers, practiced settler agriculture, converted to Christianity, that sort of thing. So the white people, you know, respected them and loved them. They said they're civilized. And the 5 civilized tribes were the Muskogee, or the Creek Indians. You may have heard of the Creek Indians, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Seminoles, right? These were the 5 tribes that were called the 5 civilized tribes. And they were also moved west of the Mississippi River into so-called Indian territory after the European settlers stole their lands and made war on them on the eastern seaboard area. And the 5 civilized tribes also, as mentioned earlier, held enslaved Africans, or held Africans in bondage. And that's one of the reasons that the Europeans called them civilized, because if you wanted to get ahead in a white supremacist society and get rich and, you know, make it big and be somebody in society, then, you know, owning slaves was the way to do so, right? And that's why at the beginning, I pay homage to the African ancestors, because it is our bodies. It was our bodies that enriched these places. And because slavery was hereditary, generational, our children and our children's children were also enslaved. So it's not like, you know, a parent was enslaved, a mom was enslaved, and if she had kids, then the kids could be free and go off and do their thing. No, the children were also enslaved, because children followed the status of their mothers under slavery. So, so the Black woman's womb was also enslaved. Her womb was enslaved because the enslaver that owned her body also owned her womb and what issued from her womb. So if she was 17 years old, oftentimes a young girl, even 12, 13, 14, you would see on their bill of sale, I hereby sell my slave Sally to Mr. Brown, but not just Sally, all her future increase. Sally could be 12 years old, but her womb was also sold, all her future increase. So slavery was generational. So the trauma was generational. So we're still going through this trauma. And it's interesting that people do not recognize Black trauma within North America and within the Americas. So the 5 civilized tribes also held slaves. And as mentioned, they walked 2 along the Trail of Tears. So anti-Black racism is not something that only white people practice. Other cultural groups, other racial groups practice anti-Black racism. We see that now very evident, not only in the practices of the 5 civilized tribes, then in historical times, but also now, today, as we speak. Because when the tribes moved to the west of the Mississippi into Indian territory sent by the federal government, the American white settler federal government, they took their slaves with them. In recent times, these tribes are treated with the United States federal government for all kinds of benefits, and including land, including money, including COVID-19 free shots, so on and so forth. But what you find happening is that the Black, in this case, let me stick to the Seminoles, the Black Seminoles are being marginalized by the Seminoles. In a recent article, a freedman Seminole, that he's descended from these original Black people who went to Indian territory with the Seminoles in early 1900 and in the early part of the 20th century and the latter part of the 19th century. So one man named Anthony Conley, who is a Black man, was denied the COVID-19 vaccine at a tribal clinic because, and I'm quoting here, he stated that racism and an unwillingness of tribal citizens to share tribal funds is at the core of the tribe's decision to exclude freedmen from full citizenship. So there's an issue right now. These Black people, phenotypically Black people who look like me, whose ancestors had been with the tribe since, let's say, day one, are now being denied certain opportunities that the federal government have given to the Seminoles. The only tribe that has given full citizenship to the Black freedmen or the Black people is the Cherokee. The Cherokee is the only tribe that has given full citizenship, and that was just recently, right? The Muskogee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminoles, no, they are denying many of the Black tribesmen their rights as tribal citizens. So you see, you see that happening with other indigenous nations too in the West, in Apache and so on, in which Black people, the Sioux, had been living as free people, but also as enslaved people. Descendants of enslaved people are being denied citizenship in that tribe. In Canada, recently we had the formation of a group. You've heard of the Métis. We know who Métis are. Well, maybe we don't. So Métis are, Métis from French means mixed, métissage. In English, people say mixed race or mulattoes. So the Métis in Canada speak to a white mixture with French, right? And you know, the Métis, Louis Riel was a Métis, for example. And if you're looking at bloodline, etc., Louis Riel would be 3/4 white and quarter native. But he identified as a Métis and with indigenous people. Louis Riel was hanged by Sir Johnny MacDonald. He rose up, he and his comrades, like Gabriel Dumont and so on, rose up because they wanted sovereignty, they wanted autonomy for what now became Manitoba. They wanted Manitoba to be a Métis province, French-speaking province, Catholic province. That didn't go down too well, and they were defeated in the rebellions. But when you look across Canada, you see many people who are white presenting, meaning they look white, claim indigeneity and claim Métis status, right? And everybody seems to be fine with that. You don't find everybody seems to be fine with Black people claiming Métis status or claiming indigenous status. But I would argue that Black people, perhaps even more than white people, have a greater claim to indigeneity and métissage, or, you know, whichever word we want to use, than many white people. So people in recent times, the writer George Eliot Clark and the singer Shelley Hamilton and Juanita Peters and others have established this group called the Afro-Métis. George Eliot Clark, as some of you may know, his grandfather on his mother's side, his maternal grandfather, is a Mi'kmaq from Nova Scotia, full-blooded Mi'kmaq. And George is saying, I am going to claim that heritage. I claim my Black heritage, but I am going to claim the Mi'kmaq heritage. Likewise, Shelley Hamilton and Juanita Peters. And there's a kind of, what I see is a kind of resistance to it, a kind of pushback. Oh, you're Black. Do not claim indigeneity. And as I've said, when white people claim indigeneity or white people say they are Métis, no problem with that. When Black people are saying, hey, we're claiming this identity, there's a pushback. And for me, that's part of the anti-Black racism that pervades every aspect of society in this country. And also, you get it from other non-Black racial groups. So I'm going to stop there because I was given my charge to speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and I think I've gone over that, and I will take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Afua. Wow, subhanAllah, that was a lot of information. It's a lot of information. I think you probably answered a lot of people's questions already. MashaAllah. So right now we're just gonna open the floor up to anyone who has a question. If you don't mind, you can speak. Like, we'll put up your hand, and then we'll unmute you, and you can speak. And feel free to also put on your camera if you want to do that as well, or you can put your question in the chat if you want to do that as well. Well, while we're waiting, a question for you about Islam and the African slaves who came over here with Islam. Was there any crossover of like Islamic knowledge to indigenous tribes? Do we have any evidence of that? Have you seen anything like that?
Well, for me personally, I read what others have written, and Leah Weiner, who wrote this book, I think the title is Africa and the Discovery of America. He was a Harvard social scientist, and a big premise in that book is that many of the phrases in certain Iroquoian language, indigenous language, according to Leo Weiner, are Mandinka phrases, that they came from West Africa. And remember when I began, I said, well, there is evidence to show that Africans were in these Americas before Christopher Columbus, before 1503, when we know the first African slaves came over to Hispaniola. And so, Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick in his book, Deeper Roots, also talk about this more than a possibility, that evidence is showing that there were Africans here before the Great Maafa, before the slave trade and slavery, and that Africans spread their cultural practices among indigenous people, especially in the Northeast United States and further up on the Eastern seaboard in what is now Canada, also in places like Panama and Mexico. So these Africans, these, from Mandinka, Soninke cultural heritage were Muslims. So one could speculate that, if there are linguistic phrases that are in Iroquoian language, that these Africans certainly also shared their religious heritage with the people that they came upon.
Okay. We have a question here from Dakida. I'm just gonna unmute you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Jazakallah khair, Auntie, that was great. I just want to know if you can speak on the cultural assimilation and the erasure in the Caribbean amongst the indigenous peoples of that land. I know most of us are from Caribbean background, and you hear about it, but it's just little bits here and there. And I like the opportunity that with your knowledge base and stuff, if you can just shed some light on about how that went down.
Right, okay, thank you. So, well, in some cases, it was just cultural erasure. It was like completely wiping out, genocide, physical genocide. That's it. There are no indigenous groups left in Jamaica, even though some people would want to say there are. I'm sure you will find genetic evidence in the people, the Black people, but there is no identifiable indigenous groups. So that speaks to the genocide, right? So by the time the English conquered Jamaica in 1655, there were indigenous people, obviously, but 50 years into the English regime, that story is over. So that's a story of tragedy and a story of woe, right? And CARICOM, the whole CARICOM 10-point plan for reparations, that is why when CARICOM now is asking for reparations, they said we want reparations for slavery and indigenous genocide, right? Because the Caribbean, the land space, whether it was the islands themselves or the continental Caribbean, parts of Central America and South America, or even Florida, and Louisiana, you could say, are Caribbean spaces. But the conquest was swift and it was brutal on the Spain, right? It was brutal and it was swift. Like millions of people were just done away with. So in what's interesting is that in many of the smaller islands, like say Dominica, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent, in which you had the Caribs, the Carib Indians as they were called, and the name for themselves was the Kalinago. And they put up fierce resistance. Christopher Columbus and the Spaniards, they couldn't even be bothered with those islands because the Caribs put up such great resistance that they just kind of left them. They left those islands. And then France came, the Carib put up, fierce resistance. Likewise, in St. Vincent, you had a group of people, and I'm glad you raised that question because now I can talk about the Black Caribs, sort of like the Black Seminoles. You had the red Caribs or the yellow Caribs. Those were supposedly the pure Caribs. And then you had the Black Caribs, right? And on the island of St. Vincent, they made war with the French. It was war in St. Vincent because the Caribs, one of their big leaders, a man called Chatoyer, who was a mixed race. He was African and he was Carib. And Chatoyer had about 3 wives or 5 wives, can't remember, and they were all African women, his wives. So huge war on St. Vincent. With Chatoyer's people, with the Black Caribs against the English. By now the English is in the mix. Eventually the Caribs were defeated and they were deported. Over 3,000 Caribs were deported to Central America, to what is now Belize and Spanish Honduras and Guatemala. So But the point I wanted to make is the Caribs are such fierce fighters that some of the places in the Caribbean where you can go today and still find, aspects of indigeneity are on the smaller islands that were dominated by the Caribs. So like St. Vincent, Dominica, and St. Lucia. I'm sure there are others. I went to Dominica about 5 years ago, and we went to greet the Carib chief on the island. Dominica still has a Carib chief. There's a region called Carib territory on the island of Dominica. We didn't get to greet the chief because when we went, we heard he had gone to town. He had gone to Rousseau, but we stayed and we talked to people in the settlement. They took us to see some of the artifacts and showed us, some cultural sites. So on those islands, you still find a visible presence of Carib people, Carib indigenous people, Kalinago people.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Let us know. There's a question here. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Dr. Cooper. Perhaps this was discussed before I joined the discussion, but in terms of Foundation Black Americans has become popular in some Black social circles in North America. Their claim is that Black Americans are not Africans, nor descendants of enslaved Africans. Rather, they are indigenous to Americas like the Seminoles, Cherokee. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Thank you. Well, that's what I was saying earlier. Some people would say, because you remember I started, one of the things indigenous people have is the claim to this land, right? Or to these continents in a way that Black people wouldn't. And then I said, well, I kind of checked myself right there. I said, after 400 or 500 years, you do have claim to something that you help to build and develop, right? So many Black people in Nova Scotia, you hear it too. They said they're Afro-Indigenous or Indigenous African Nova Scotians. And that is to say they have been there over 200, 300, 400 years. So they have a claim, right? Let it be known that the people who own the most real estate in Canada and United States are not, Indigenous people. It's still white men. So when people are talking about Black people are settlers, I'm like, hey, wait a minute. 99% of the land in Canada is still owned by white men. Black people don't own anything in Canada. So I don't know what, we are probably squatters as opposed to settlers. But if African Americans, some African Americans, it would hold true for some African Americans who have been living, as I said, among the so-called 5 civilized tribes, the Seminoles being one of them. And they're saying they're indigenous African Americans. That's fine. That's okay. They can articulate whatever identity they want to articulate. It's their thing, right? But at the same time, I'm not going to engage in fiction because most of us were descended from enslaved people who were captured and stolen from Africa and brought here. If I'm claiming any kind of indigeneity, and indigeneity doesn't necessarily mean you're descended from, that you have Indians. I'm using the old term, if you know what I mean. Indigeneity, the Maroon communities in Jamaica, for example, they say they are an indigenous African people in Jamaica. Maroons claim indigeneity because they had been given or treated. They had 2 wars with the British. They came to a peace treaty, and part of the treaty was that the land on which they settled was sovereign, that they exercised sovereignty over those lands. So according to United Nations declaration of, this whole concept of indigeneity, the Jamaican Maroons are an indigenous people. That doesn't mean they're not Africans. They're Africans. So sometimes we really have to realize that the word indigenous or indigeneity is very nuanced. It's really broad-based, right?
Dakota has another question. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Dakota.
All right,
And if I may just add one minute there. I mean, most enslaved people, for example, didn't live among the Seminoles or the 5 civilized tribes, you know what I mean? So most enslaved people can't claim any kind of descent from Seminoles or Cherokee or Chickasaw or what have you. Sorry, go ahead, please.
Dr. Afua, I just wanted to ask, what would a Truth and Reconciliation Commission look like for Black people in North America, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a good question. And
I mean, because if we're all in this moment, what would it look like for you with your knowledge base and where we're at right now? Like, what can you speak to that?
Yeah, I can speak to that. And I mean, we do need to have one of those, have that process happen in Canada. It hasn't happened. People are calling for it, but it hasn't happened. It's more than time. I think we can look at the CARICOM model. CARICOM is a Caribbean community, and there are about at least 14 member states that have joined CARICOM. They are associate states, they're also observer states. And the CARICOM model, the 10-point plan for reparations, is kind of a truth and reconciliation document. So we should look, I can't tell you, you know, from one to 10, what are the 10 points are, but they're calling a huge part of the CARICOM model deals with development. So for example, development of infrastructure, proper hospitals, schools, attention to certain diseases that plague Black people. So like diabetes, hypertension, so on and so forth. Because in the Caribbean, certainly that space, but Black people as a whole across these Americas, you know, diabetes is huge, a huge thing. And how is that? Diabetes has now kind of become genetic among Black people, almost like a genetic disease. The folks who are rolling out the CARICOM plan, they're saying, look, in the Caribbean, these were sugar plantations, the whole sugar. That says it all with respect to our diet. Our diet was bad, it was poor. And then the whole saltfish that we used to consume, which came from Canada, by the way, as the main protein source. So all these things led to us having bad health generationally. But with respect to Canada, so I think we need to look at the CARICOM document. You can find it online because it does provide a model, and we don't have a model yet for Canada. We can look at the TRC model. There are 94 recommendations in the TRC model for Indigenous people. But for me, the whole issue of health and education would be critical if we were to do a TRC for the Black community across Canada, health and education and criminal justice.
Was that good, Dakota? Did she answer your question?
What do you think? What's your idea? What would you want to see in that TRC document?
I mean, there's so much information that's coming out now that, I mean, I would have to, I don't know. There's so many stories that were hidden, you know, so many things have become like myths and legends, and you're finding out that are actual historical facts, that we were part and parcel of the building of these empires, if you want to call it that. Yeah. I don't know where to start because it's been hidden from us for so long. You know what I mean? Like, I would have to take lead from somebody like yourself or people who have studied these things to know where we could start. But I forget if
Yeah,
we're
I
in the
mean,
moment.
cultural reparation is huge, right? The learning or the relearning of one's history and heritage, because you use knowledge to really hide people from themselves, right? So, one of the rubrics that was mentioned is the cultural erasure. That's real. That's real. When we don't know who we are, we don't know our names, we don't know the fact that now we know that at least they're telling us, people have done the research, that at least 33% of the enslaved people over the how many centuries that came to these Americas were Muslims, right? Could be more, but at least 33%. We didn't know that. Maybe one or two people knew a long time ago, and even today, people still don't know that, right? A significant a part of the enslaved population were Muslims. So, the first people who made the adhan in North America, South America, and the Caribbean were Black people, were Muslims. We made the first adhan that was called, subhanallah, in these Americas, was made by Black people coming from West Africa. So there's so much that's been erased that we have to dig and excavate and rediscover and recover. And so the cultural aspect is a huge part. When we're talking about a TRC for Black people, just the way we've been denied our history, that, the Ontario Black History Society, they had a program, I think last Black History Month in February, where it was called Black Out, where they took some of the main Canadian history texts for high school and they black out all of the information that didn't have to do with Black people. And it's like they blacked out the entire book, because there was hardly anything there in this day and age, in 2021. So that's part of the violence of slavery and colonization that has been our experience. It's tremendously violent and tremendously traumatic, to the point that we don't know ourselves, and we are ashamed of who we are. We are ashamed of our complexion. We're ashamed of our hair texture. We internalize racism. We don't like ourselves. We treat white people better than we treat ourselves. You see it. You see sometimes how Black people treat each other, like with such disdain. Then a white people comes in the room and they're like, oh, respectful. So that's part of the trauma. That's part of the forced assimilation. That's part of the institutionalized racism.
SubhanAllah. Maybe it's one of the reasons why, if a Black person has any sign of a drop of indigenous blood, we'd want to go for that, right? We would want to take that on, not only just for the what rights that do come with it, but for the fact that it actually shows that we're mixed with something else.
Black people love to say they're mixed. I'm sorry. We're gonna find that Jewish ancestor and that Scottish ancestor and that indigenous. Zora Neale Hurston, the writer, she said, and she's from Florida. She was born in Florida and she came up to New York, and so part of the Harlem Renaissance. And she said, every Black person you meet, they tell you that their grandfather was an Indian chief. I mean, it was like a tongue-in-cheek comment. Yeah. There's some truth in it, but she was kind of really said, come on, why can't you just be Black? What's wrong in your being Black, in say you're Black, in having this Blackness? Let's just go Black all the way. We don't always have to punctuate our identity with, this Scottish guy who was a rapist. No. When you read Malcolm X's book, he said, yeah, I had this white guy in my lineage, but he was a rapist. Why am I going to celebrate him? So it's almost like being Black is never enough, because we can't see any beauty in it. Well, being Black is hard, though. You know, you're walking down the street, you're under surveillance and all of that. So I understand when people want to claim that,
Yeah.
you know, that ancestor from Finland, for heaven's sakes.
Yeah.
I did my DNA and my brother was looking for the white ancestor. I'm like, sorry, it's not there.
You didn't find any?
Didn't find any. They said there
Really?
was 2% that they couldn't identify.
Oh, wow.
I'm like, okay.
No, that's very rare, though, right?
Not really, because I have a lot of genetic cousins. Because once you join, they kind of something pop up in your email. Oh, you have the same breakdown and makeup as somebody in St. Vincent, right? Or somebody in South Carolina. It's not rare.
Okay. No.
But
Uh,
but even if there was mixture, like big deal. You know what I mean? Like big deal. When I'm walking down the street or going into a place, nobody's looking for, oh, there's a 2% mixture there. No, they're racist as anything else.
the state of our minds.
Well, maybe
Iman?
the first thing is mental emancipation for us.
Yes.
That's our first reparations, is mental emancipation.
Definitely. Definitely. Iman, is your hand up?
Yes, Salam alaikum. Salam alaikum, Dr. Afua. Thank you
Alaikum
very
salam.
much for this beautiful presentation. One thing that you mentioned when you spoke about trauma, it's such a huge topic, and oftentimes I think as Black people, we don't know where to start because it's so deep and there's so many layers to it. I attended this lecture, and the sister that was speaking is a doctor, and she works in a trauma hospital in the UK. And she was saying that trauma is so deep that it changes completely your DNA. It has such an impact on even your brain function. But one thing she mentioned, and I think it's very important and it gives hope, is that she said we're able to reverse that trauma mentally just by having someone that's there for you and that cares for you, that shows that you matter, whether it's a parent, whether it's family members, whether it's a friend. So often I'm just sharing that to know that, just to give hope that there is possibility. And it's something as simple as caring for one another. You mentioned something very key. As Black people, we always have a barrier with one another. But if we can at least put this barrier down, we can at least start a conversation. Because that work that needs to be done is so much, and it gets so much overwhelming that, like I said, you don't know where to start. But if at least we care, and I know it sounds very cliche and maybe it's not in style, and as Black people, we can't even talk about that the fact that we care about each other, because you're seen as too soft, or that's not the way Black people talk. But at least if we can change that mentality when it comes to caring, I think it can give us some hope and somewhere to start. So I
Right,
just wanted
thank
to share
you.
that.
No, I completely agree. The doctor you're talking about is in the UK is correct. And research is bearing out what you're saying about emotional intelligence, about empathy, how empathy and compassion, but we know that too, right? We know that as Muslims, there are numerous verses in the Quran that talks about that. And how the showing love and care and engaging in certain behavior and practices, actually these practices and these actions do change the brain structure and the what you call those things, the synapses. They can really rewire the brain from an organ that if you're to look at it on a screen, is very confused, and the synapses and the neural networks are all over the place and looking really chaotic. And when you show love and empathy and care and do certain breath work and do certain prayers, then you see the neural those cords, whatever they're called, the synapses, coming back in alignment and in coherence. It's really beautiful. I've watched this on screen. They come back in coherence, and then even the heart rate changes, right? It slows down, and the body comes back in harmony and in balance. So you know, again, this is all part of reparation. I would ask for these things because there's a lot of healing that needs to be done. The first thing we have to recognize and admit that we are in this crisis, that we are in this trauma. The way it's so hard on Black people. I mean, if you think now with all this vaccine thing and so many people are being threatened, you know, with job loss and COVID and all of that, the impact all of this is having on the Black community worldwide. And you think, oh my God, another thing to beat us down, right? So we have to build communities of resilience, we have to begin with our own families and even with our own selves, right? But I think if we really center ourselves in our faith, then we do have an advantage, because even maybe I'm gonna go up. No, it's not really off topic. The way how Muslims earlier on, 100,000 years ago, 500 years, used to build hospitals, for example. A typical Muslim hospital the building would surround a courtyard. There would be a fountain in the courtyard. And people can correct me if you think I'm wrong or talk about other forms of architecture. But there'll be fountains in the courtyards. And you hear the nice water, which is very soothing to the patient, especially the patient has mental health issues, right? So the architects and the doctors, they understood the human mind. There would be beautiful flowers planted. If you think of what the hospitals are like, this concrete structure, you can't see anything. There's light blaring down on you 24 hours. But flowers would be planted. And in some of these hospitals, in the courtyard would be musicians playing soothing music on their lutes and on their guitars or what have you, whatever instrument they're playing. That was part of medicine. That was part of healing. The Muslim doctors and scientists, they understood that the human body was intimately connected to the human mind. So the healing was holistic, right? And the recitation of certain verses of the Quran calms the human mind and actually can heal the brain and heal the body. But I think we have strayed so far from that we are now into big time into allopathic medicine, into Western medicine. We just do our prayers as a matter of course, because we have to pray 5 times a day, but we just do that. Well, how about prayer as a form of healing?
Yeah. So it's 9:12. And we have to end this session. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Afua, for all of this knowledge that you just imparted on us, and just kind of just enlightened us. And the last statement that you just made there about prayer, I think obviously, like, everybody here will probably understand and know that that's like the most important thing. And this is why we're gonna end with a dua that Bakita is gonna read for us. Hopefully she's still online. And
I am still here.
okay.
I just want to say something right quick before I
Yeah.
get into the Dr. Afua, you mentioned the Caribs and the Arawak, and those are things that we've just heard in the past. I would love if you can come back and do a session with us based on these people in the Caribbean for BCM one day, because
Yeah.
it's important that we kind of know that part of our history and roots as well.
Yeah, that's
Okay, for sure.
Right? I know, you made a lot of mention about the smaller islands, but we didn't know the small islands have such big stories. So I would like to hear about their contribution to the resistance as well.
Yes.
Okay, inshallah.
Yes.
And also too, before you start, Bakita, Dr. Afua, if you can maybe give us a book list of things that we can read based on what you presented to us today, that would be great. If you could.
All right, Belkis, I'll send that to you.
Yeah, in an email.
Yeah.
Yeah, to the BCM email.
Okay.
And then I'll share that with other people, inshallah.
Okay.
So yes, Dakida, are you ready?
One second.
No worries.
All right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. You guys can hear me?
Yes, we can.
Take munchkin out. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. O Allah, our Lord, our Rabb, our peace, our refuge, our protector. Free us from these generations of bondage. Free us from the misuse of power and injustice. Free us from fear and free us from fear and inferiority amongst us and amongst creation. Free us from the cries that ring out in the streets during the bloody injustice of the days and the terrors that overflow with penetrating grief in the long nights. Free us from ways of thinking that counter your divine guidance and truth. Free us from systems of hate that kill, mar, maim, and taint. Free us from the blatant and subtle forms of discrimination and oppression. Grant us life, Ya Rab. Grant us life, Ya Rab. Grant us life, Ya Rab. Save our men and comfort our women, and grant us lives that are truly free, and grant us justice and peace, and grant us freedom and light, and grant us love and gratitude. Ennoble us with your divine grace and abundant favor, Ya Rab. Pour out upon us strength and beautiful patience and the reward of beautiful patience, Ya Rabbi. Deliver us from abusive powers in the way that you freed Bani Israel from the grips of Fir'aun. Drown deception with the flood of truth, the way that the waters have overcame the tyranny of Pharaoh. Protect our faith and strengthen us, whereas we use our power of freedom for your sake, and we do not go astray in our freedom. Protect us from oppressing others, and make our hearts full with empathy and compassion for the oppressed amongst us. Save our battered bodies, Ya Rab. Save our striving souls, Ya Rab. Save our heavy hearts, Ya Rab. None can save save you, and none can free save you. None can grant peace except you. You are the one who gives, and you are the one that gives, even as you withhold. You are the one who does not turn away the servant who asks of you. Do not turn us away, and please deliver us and elevate us and dignify us. And for all those, may you grant protection whose days are like the days of Karbala and their days are like Ashura. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa alihi. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala akhlihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Subhanallahi wa bihamdihi, subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika, wa nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta wa nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.
Thank you, Dr. Afua, again for
Thank you
joining
everyone. Thank
us.
you,
And
Bilkis.
thank you, everyone, for coming on. Inshallah, look out for our live on Sunday, where it's going to be a panel of our Black brothers. Inshallah, yeah, that's on Instagram, and we're going to try to get it over to Facebook, inshallah. So everyone have a good night, inshallah, and take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum salam.
Assalamu alaikum.